The legend of Ranger Elias Mason had haunted the staff of Blackstone National Park for decades. It wasn't something you heard on official tours, but rather in low, cautious whispers around campfires or in the break room during late shifts. His story was one of isolation, madness, and an unforgiving forest that seemed to hold its secrets tighter than any living soul. Deep in the untouched North Quadrant, a stretch of wilderness so dense it felt forgotten by time, Elias had patrolled the rugged terrain for over 20 years. He was a solitary figure with sharp, piercing eyes and a deliberate stride that could cut through the thickest fog or the dead of night. What truly set Elias apart was his unwavering commitment to the rules. To the newer rangers, he was both a figure of respect and a source of unease. He lived by the park regulations like they were etched into his very being, earning a reputation as the ranger who never wavered, never faltered. And so, when a rookie ranger named Sarah was assigned to join him on a routine patrol one crisp autumn evening, she couldn't help but feel both intrigued and apprehensive. The stories she'd heard, of shadows that moved without cause, of whispers that seemed to follow you deep into the woods, felt like nothing more than campfire tales. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest began to exhale a cold, heavy breath, Sarah's confidence started to falter. The patrol began normally enough, their boots crunching over the blanket of fallen leaves as the last golden light filtered through the twisted trees. Elias moved with an unsettling silence, his eyes scanning the underbrush, his steps deliberate and unhurried. It wasn't long before Sarah felt the oppressive stillness around them. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. She tried to push away the creeping sense of unease, but every rustle, every faint sound in the distance felt like it carried a deeper meaning. At one point, Elias stopped abruptly, raising his hand. "Do you feel it?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. Sarah hesitated. "Feel what?" "The forest. It's watching." She opened her mouth to laugh it off, but something about his tone stopped her. His eyes held a seriousness that sent a chill down her spine. Before she could reply, he resumed walking, his pace quicker now, his body language tense. The deeper they ventured, the more alien the forest seemed. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark marked with strange, unrecognizable symbols. Sarah asked Elias about them, but he only muttered something about old warnings before pressing on. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Their flashlights barely cut through the thickening darkness. They reached a clearing where a crumbling cabin stood like a forgotten relic. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the walls were blackened as if scorched by fire long ago. Elias signaled for Sarah to stay back and move toward the structure alone. She obeyed, her flashlight tracing the edges of the clearing. When her beam caught a reflection, two pinpoints of light, like eyes staring back, she froze. She turned quickly, but whatever she'd seen was gone. Inside the cabin, Elias found remnants of a life long abandoned. A rusted lantern, a decaying journal, and deep claw marks etched into the walls. He flipped open the journal, its pages brittle, the ink smudged with time. The words he could still make out sent a shiver through him. "They come at dusk. They were the faces of those you trust." Elias returned to Sarah, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." She didn't argue. His urgency cut through her growing fear. As they began to retrace their steps, the forest seemed to turn against them. Paths they had taken earlier were now blocked by tangled thorns. The canopy above grew denser, choking out what little moonlight had once guided their way. An eerie silence enveloped them, broken only by their own footsteps. Then came the laughter. It started as a faint giggle, like a child's laugh carried on the wind. But it grew louder, more guttural, more twisted. The flashlight in Sarah's hand flickered as if the batteries were failing. She felt Elias's grip tighten on her arm. "Keep walking," he whispered. "Don't look back." The laughter morphed into a cacophony of voices, each one eerily familiar. They called Sarah's name in tones that sounded like her own voice, but distorted and mocking. Her resolve faltered, and despite Elias's warning, she glanced over her shoulder. What she saw turned her blood cold. Figures emerged from the shadows, their features shifting and melting like smoke. One of them wore her face, a twisted reflection of herself with a sinister, knowing smile. "Sarah, move." Elias's bark jolted her into motion. They ran, the forest closing in on them, the voices growing louder, more taunting. Sarah stumbled, but Elias yanked her to her feet. The darkness felt alive, pressing against them as they fought their way through the dense undergrowth. Finally, they burst into another clearing where Elias's truck was parked. He shoved Sarah into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and started the engine. As they sped away, Sarah glanced back through the rear window. The figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their shifting forms illuminated briefly in the truck's red tail lights. One of them raised a hand, a slow, mocking wave. When they reached the ranger station, Elias locked every door and window. His hands trembled as he secured the building. Sarah tried to ask him what had happened, what they'd seen, but he only shook his head. "Don't speak of this," he said firmly. "Not to anyone." Sarah never returned to the North Quadrant. In fact, she left the Park Service altogether. But the memories of that night refused to fade. They clung to her dreams, turning them into nightmares. Elias continued his solitary patrols, but those who worked with him noticed the change. His eyes grew hollow, his demeanor withdrawn. He would sometimes mutter to himself, as if arguing with an unseen presence. One frigid winter night, Elias didn't return from his shift. A search party was sent out, but all they found was his hat, placed neatly on a tree stump deep in the North Quadrant. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. To this day, visitors to Blackstone National Park's northern woods report strange happenings. Whispers ride the wind, laughter echoes from unseen sources, and figures vanish as soon as they are approached. The legend of Ranger Elias Mason endures, a chilling reminder of the forest's unforgiving depths and the secrets that should never be disturbed. Ethan Crowley never imagined his last assignment as a park ranger would take him to Whispering Pines, a stretch of wilderness so vast and untouched that even seasoned hikers avoided it. The forest was a place of legends, tales of those who wandered too far and never returned, whispered at campfires for generations. But Ethan didn't believe in ghost stories. He'd been a ranger for 15 years, had seen every oddity the woods could offer, and figured Whispering Pines was just another overgrown patch of land. Yet, as the sun dipped behind the dense canopy on his first night alone, he couldn't shake a peculiar sense of unease. The forest was silent, too silent. No insects chirped, no distant howls carried on the wind. Only the creak of swaying branches and the occasional rustle of unseen movement broke the stillness. By his second week, Ethan chalked it up to his own imagination. After all, the mind can play tricks in the absence of human contact. He kept his patrols tight, his reports thorough, and his evenings uneventful. Until the night the voice came through the radio. It was nearly midnight. Ethan was reviewing maps by lantern light when static hissed through the radio on his desk. He froze. The channel was supposed to be silent. There were no other rangers left in this quadrant, not after 6 had disappeared over the past 5 years. Then the static faded, replaced by a thin, panicked voice. "Help me. It's out here. It's watching me." The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, leaving only the crackle of dead air. Adrenaline surged as Ethan grabbed his flashlight and rifle. No visitors had registered for the week, but someone was clearly in trouble. The rational part of him said to call for backup, but backup was hours away. If he didn't act now, whoever made that call might vanish like the others. Against every instinct telling him to stay put, Ethan stepped into the night. The forest changed as he moved deeper into it. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the metallic tang of decayed vegetation. Pines that once stood tall and straight now leaned inward, their branches knotted together like skeletal hands blocking out the moonlight. The beam of his flashlight pierced the darkness, but the shadows seemed to shift at the edges of his vision, slinking back just beyond reach. His breaths came shallow, his boots crunching on the forest floor sounding deafeningly loud. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the stillness. No reply, just the creak of branches overhead. The deeper he went, the more alien the forest felt. And then, through the trees, he saw it. A figure crouched in the distance, illuminated by his wavering flashlight. Relief briefly flooded him. Someone was alive. "Hey!" he shouted. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It remained still, its back to him, huddled against the trunk of a gnarled pine. Cautiously, Ethan approached, rifle at the ready. "Sir? Ma'am?" He tried again, his voice breaking. Still no response. As he drew closer, the beam of his flashlight revealed the figure wasn't human, or at least, not entirely. Its limbs were elongated, the skin pulled taut over two thin bones. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and where a face should have been, there was only a dark void, with faint glimmers of something watching him from deep within. Ethan's blood ran cold. He aimed the rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. "Don't move," he commanded, though his voice betrayed his fear. The creature remained still for a moment, then turned its head toward him with a fluid, rippling motion. A sound like wet leaves shifting against each other filled the air. Then it grinned. The grin stretched impossibly wide, and from that void came a single word, "Run." Ethan fired. The gunshot rang out, shattering the unnatural silence. But the bullet passed through the figure like smoke, hitting a tree behind it. The creature's form shimmered, growing taller, and it took a step toward him. Ethan's instincts took over. He turned and ran, the laughter following close behind. Branches clawed at his arms and face as he sprinted blindly. The forest warped around him, paths that had been clear minutes ago now looping back on themselves. The shadows moved, but not in any way he understood. It was as if the forest was alive, twisting and reshaping itself to keep him contained. The laughter grew louder, shifting from a low chuckle to a piercing cacophony. Finally, he stumbled into a small clearing. The laughter stopped, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. In the middle of the clearing stood a cabin, its walls blackened and covered in deep claw marks. A faint, flickering lantern light came from within. Ethan hesitated, his every nerve screaming to turn back, but something compelled him forward. Perhaps it was the faint hope of sanctuary, or maybe the sense that he had no other choice. He pushed open the door. Inside, the air was cold, thick with an acrid smell. The cabin was empty except for a single chair and a mirror hanging on the far wall. Ethan stepped toward the mirror, and his heart sank. In the reflection, he saw himself. But it wasn't just him. His uniform was torn and bloodied, his face pale and gaunt, and behind him stood the creature. Its void-like eyes locked onto his, the grin wider than ever. Ethan spun around, but there was nothing there. He turned back to the mirror, but the reflection was gone. The lantern flickered, casting long, warped shadows, and then it went out, plunging the room into pitch black. A cold hand clamped down on his shoulder. Ethan screamed. By morning, the park rangers sent to check on him found only his abandoned radio and rifle, lying in a patch of disturbed ground. No sign of Ethan remained, though they swore they could hear faint laughter carried on the wind. To this day, no one patrols Whispering Pines after dark. They say the forest is alive, that it watches, that it remembers, and that it takes what it wants. The Devil's Spire loomed over Redwood Gorge, a jagged monolith that pierced the sky like a shard of glass. Locals whispered about it in hushed tones, spinning tales of hikers who wandered too close and never returned, of unsettling whispers that carried on the wind, and of something ancient and malevolent that called the spire home. Most dismissed these stories as folklore, just ghost stories meant to keep thrill seekers away. But the park's rangers knew better. 6 had disappeared over 5 years, their vanishings quieted by vague official statements and unexplained patrol realignments. These were not ordinary accidents. Something was wrong in the northwestern quadrant of Redwood Gorge, and the spire was at the center of it. Ranger Mark Holloway had worked these woods for over a decade. He wasn't a man prone to superstition or drama. He preferred his solitude, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the forest floor, the soft rustle of trees that stood silent witness to generations. When he first heard the stories, he shrugged them off. Redwood Gorge was a massive wilderness. People got lost. Sometimes they fell, sometimes they wandered too far off the beaten path. It was tragic, yes, but not unexplainable. That was until the night Mark heard the voice over the radio. It was a bitter winter evening. The kind where the cold sank into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Mark had just finished his final sweep of the southern trails and was ready to call it a night when the transmission came through, faint and crackling. "Help me," the voice said, fragile and strained. "It's out here. It's watching me." Static followed. Mark's heart jumped. No visitors were logged in that quadrant, not in weeks. The weather was brutal. Snow fell in heavy sheets, visibility was near zero, and the wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal. Nobody should be out there. His instinct screamed to wait until morning, but protocol was clear. Respond immediately to distress signals. He strapped on his snowshoes, checked his flashlight, and shouldered his pack. As he left the warmth of the ranger station behind, a cold knot of unease settled in his chest. The forest felt different that night. The towering pines seemed to lean closer together, their branches interlocking in unnatural patterns that blocked what little moonlight managed to cut through the storm. Mark kept his radio on, calling out periodically, but the static only deepened. His flashlight beam was swallowed by the swirling snow, casting shadows that twisted and shifted like living things. He pressed on, guided by memory and a gut feeling he couldn't explain. Hours passed. No tracks. No signs of anyone. Just the relentless storm and the weight of isolation. Then, just as Mark was considering turning back, his flashlight caught something in the snow. Bare footprints. They were fresh, human, and inexplicably barefoot. "Jesus," Mark muttered, staring at the prints. In this weather, without shoes or boots, the person should be hypothermic or worse. He followed the trail as it wound deeper into the forest, moving faster now, his pulse pounding in his ears. The footprints led him to the spire. Mark had seen the Devil's Spire many times before, from a safe distance. Up close, it was a nightmare. Its sheer cliffs were streaked with ice, its surface pockmarked with jagged outcroppings. Tonight, it was more than a mountain. It felt alive, as if the rock itself breathed. He shone his flashlight upward and froze. About halfway up the cliff face was a faint orange glow. It flickered like firelight, unnatural and out of place in the storm. Against his better judgment, Mark began to climb. The rock was slick with ice, but footholds seemed to appear just as he needed them, as though the mountain itself wanted him to ascend. He climbed higher, the glow drawing him like a moth to a flame, until he reached the source, a cave entrance pulsing with that strange, warm light. Inside, the air was unnaturally warm. The storm's howls were muted, replaced by a rhythmic thrum that made Mark's chest vibrate. Carvings covered the cave walls, intricate, ancient patterns that shifted when he looked at them directly, almost as if the stone were alive. At the center of the cavern was a fire pit, but no wood or kindling fed the flames. They licked upward from bare rock, twisting in shapes that hurt his eyes. "Mark," a voice called. It was soft, melodic, yet alien. It came from deeper within the cave. "Mark, come closer." Mark's stomach churned. Nobody knew he was here. Nobody except whatever this was. He edged forward, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist. The cave widened into a massive chamber. A figure stood in the center, its back turned. It was a woman, her tattered clothing hanging like rags. Her hair was wild, streaked with frost and snow, and her frame was too thin, too angular. "Are you okay?" Mark called out, his voice shaking. The figure turned slowly. Mark's breath hitched. Her eyes were voids, blacker than night, deeper than the cave around them. Her mouth split into a grin that seemed to stretch too wide, revealing teeth like shattered glass. She took a step closer. Mark stepped back. She smiled wider. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice dripping with an ancient, hungry joy. "So long. I knew you would come." Mark fumbled for his flashlight, the beam shaking as it flickered over the chamber walls. He saw them then, figures embedded in the stone. Dozens, hundreds, men and women, faces twisted in terror, mouths open in silent screams, their hands frozen as though clawing at the air. Rangers, campers, hikers, the missing, all of them were here. He turned back to the woman, but she was already moving toward him, her jerky, unnatural steps closing the distance. Mark stumbled, dropped his flashlight, and scrambled back toward the tunnel. "Stay," her voice called, echoing around him. "You'll never be alone again." Mark ran. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he didn't stop. The cave seemed to twist around him, the walls pulsing as if alive, but he kept moving. Behind him, her voice turned into a chorus of laughter, of whispers, of screams. He burst out into the snow, the storm stinging his face. He didn't look back. He just ran, never stopping until he reached the ranger station's faint lights. Mark filed a report the next day. He wrote about the storm, the footprints, and the glow, but he left out the woman, the faces in the stone, the voice. They wouldn't believe him. Hell, he barely believed it himself. But he knew what he saw, and he knew he'd never go near the spire again. A week later, another flare was spotted near the Devil's Spire. Mark didn't volunteer to investigate. No one did. What do you think happened to the 6 rangers before Mark? Could there be a way to free those trapped in the stone? Callahan Woods was the kind of place everyone in Haven Hollow whispered about, but never dared to visit after dark. For generations, the small town's parents had passed down the same warning: stay away. The forest wasn't just dense and labyrinthine. It was something else entirely, a place with a mind of its own. People went in and didn't come back. Those lucky few who did emerge changed, their eyes hollow and their voices distant, as if the forest had taken a piece of their souls. Ranger Abigail Dewey wasn't one for ghost stories. She had patrolled the trails of Callahan Woods for 3 years and never encountered more than a frightened deer or a wayward camper. Sure, she'd heard the local legends about hikers who vanished without a trace and strange lights in the treetops, but she chalked it up to imagination and bad weather. At least, she did until the night that everything changed. It was late October, and a sharp chill had settled over the forest. Abigail was back at the ranger station, warming her hands around a cup of instant coffee, when the emergency call came in. A family camping deep in the woods had heard something outside their tent: footsteps, whispers, and laughter that didn't belong to them. The mother's voice on the line was panicked, and the call ended with a piercing scream. Dispatch tried to reconnect, but the signal was dead. Abigail hesitated. Protocol dictated she investigate immediately, but the thought of heading out alone into the frozen night unsettled her. Still, it was her job. Grabbing her flashlight, rifle, and radio, she set out. She drove as far as the narrow trails allowed, then continued on foot. The forest swallowed her in its darkness, the fog curling around her boots as the wind twisted through the gnarled branches. Every sound was magnified: the crunch of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of something unseen. The deeper she went, the more the woods felt alive. After an hour of navigating the maze of trees, she found the campsite. It was a wreck. The tent had been shredded as if by massive claws, and supplies were scattered across the snow-dusted ground. Ripped sleeping bags and overturned pots littered the scene. Abigail's stomach churned when she noticed a smear of blood leading away from the site. She radioed for backup, but the only response was heavy static. Her pulse quickened. Something was terribly wrong. Steeling herself, Abigail followed the blood trail. Her flashlight flickered and dimmed, and for the first time, she felt genuine fear. The air grew heavier, colder. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches knitting together like grotesque claws. Then she entered a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a massive oak, its bark blackened and slick with a tar-like substance. The blood trail stopped there. Abigail stepped closer, scanning the area with her flashlight. The air was so still it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Then she heard it: laughter. Soft, melodic, and completely out of place. She spun around, shining her light into the shadows, but saw nothing. The laughter grew louder, echoing from all directions. Then it stopped, replaced by the sound of movement, something large shifting in the darkness. "Hello?" Abigail called, her voice trembling. A figure stumbled out of the shadows toward her. It was a man, his clothes torn, his face pale and gaunt. She recognized him as one of the missing campers. "Sir, are you hurt?" she asked, moving cautiously toward him. He raised his head, and Abigail froze. His eyes were pitch-black voids, absorbing the beam of her flashlight. He opened his mouth, but no words came, just a guttural, inhuman growl. Before she could react, his body convulsed, twisting unnaturally. His arms bent at impossible angles as he dropped to all fours and scuttled back into the forest like a grotesque spider. Abigail stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. The woods around her seemed to close in, the trees leaning inward as if they were alive. She turned to run but found herself face to face with the blackened oak. Something was carved into its bark, her name etched deep and fresh. Panic surged through her. The laughter returned, louder now. A cacophony of voices that sounded almost human but not quite. Shadows shifted at the edge of the clearing, taking shape. Some of the figures looked familiar, hikers she'd seen on missing persons bulletins, while others were distorted, barely human at all. Their eyes glowed faintly, and they stared at her without a word. "Stay back," Abigail shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive air. The ground beneath her feet gave way suddenly, and she fell. She landed in a cavern, the stench of decay overwhelming her. Her flashlight flickered, revealing walls lined with bones. Skulls stared at her, their empty sockets filled with writhing roots. The walls seemed to pulse, and a black tar-like substance oozed from every surface. Then she saw it. In the center of the cavern was a mass of shadows, constantly shifting and reforming. Limbs and faces emerged and disappeared, each one screaming silently. The mass moved toward her, and the pressure in her head became unbearable, as though her thoughts were being ripped apart. A voice, no, multiple voices, spoke directly into her mind in a grotesque harmony. "You should not have come." Abigail screamed and tried to scramble back, but the tar was rising, pulling at her legs and arms. The shadows engulfed her, the voices consuming her entirely. When the backup team arrived the next morning, they found her Jeep at the trailhead and her radio still on. In the woods, they discovered her flashlight and a single boot near the blackened oak. But of Abigail, there was no trace. Callahan Woods remains closed to this day, but the locals still tell stories. Late at night, if you stand on the edge of the forest, you might hear faint laughter on the wind. And if you're foolish enough to venture into the woods, don't be surprised if the shadows seem to move. Callahan Woods doesn't just claim its victims, it keeps them. The locals called it Deadwater Lake, though no official map carried that name. Tucked deep within Silver Pines National Forest, it was a place people avoided at all costs. The water was so unnaturally still that it reflected the surrounding world like a polished mirror. Legends spoke of whispers rising from its depths, of spectral figures stalking the shoreline, and of those who entered the lake, never to return. Ranger Lucas Kane had always dismissed such stories as the stuff of campfire folklore. That is, until the night he got the call. It was just after sunset when a hiker burst into the ranger station. His face was pale, his eyes wide with unspoken terror. "My brother," the man stammered. He went into the water. Something pulled him under." The hiker's hands trembled as he pointed toward the direction of the lake. Lucas could see the fear etched into his every movement. Despite the hiker's insistence that he couldn't go back, Lucas grabbed his flashlight and gear and set out alone. The path to the lake was barely discernible in the dim light, the narrow trail hemmed in by towering pines. As he walked, a suffocating silence pressed down on him. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no nocturnal animals. Just an oppressive stillness that grew heavier the closer he got. When he finally reached the lake, the sight took his breath away. The water was a flawless mirror, reflecting the full moon and jagged treetops with eerie precision. The air was thick, the atmosphere charged with a tension he couldn't explain. There was no sign of disturbance, no footprints, no scattered belongings, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here. "Hello?" Lucas called, his voice cutting through the unnatural quiet. "Is anyone out here?" At first, the lake offered no reply. Then, without warning, a ripple disturbed the perfect surface. His flashlight beam locked on the disturbance. Slowly, the ripple expanded, radiating outward from the lake's center. He froze, heart pounding, as something pale broke the water. A hand, clawing desperately at the air. "Hold on," Lucas yelled as he sprinted toward the shoreline. His boots sank into the soft mud as he illuminated the figure. A young man's face emerged, wide-eyed and gasping. It had to be the missing brother. Lucas didn't hesitate. He plunged into the icy water, wading toward the thrashing figure. The cold was a sharp, immediate shock, piercing his skin and seeping into his bones. But the freezing temperature wasn't the worst part. The water felt alive, shifting, pulling him with a force that went beyond any current he'd ever experienced. When he reached out for the man, his hand passed straight through him, as though grasping empty air. The figure disappeared, dissolving into the water. "What the?" Lucas turned, confused and disoriented. That's when he heard it, a soft, melodic voice whispering behind him. "Why did you come?" His flashlight beam darted toward the shore. There, standing at the water's edge, was a figure cloaked in shadow. Its features were indistinct, almost fluid, but its presence radiated malice. "You shouldn't have disturbed the water," the voice murmured, echoing from every direction. Suddenly, the lake erupted into chaos. The surface, once perfectly still, began to churn violently. The glassy calm was replaced by a boiling maelstrom. Shapes rose from the depths, faces, hands, bodies, each one distorted and wrong. Their hollow eyes fixed on Lucas, their mouths twisted into agonized, silent screams. Lucas tried to swim toward the shore, but the harder he fought, the stronger the pull became. The water seemed to thicken around him, dragging him down. Shadows moved beneath the surface, circling him, their lifeless forms just out of reach. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but his movements were sluggish, as if the lake was feeding on his strength. Then came the laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. It reverberated through the water. The shadowy figure on the shore raised an arm, and the lake surged. Lucas felt something clamp around his ankle, yanking him under. He fought desperately, kicking at whatever held him, but the world above faded into darkness. Underwater, the dim light of his flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of the horrors around him. Figures drifted closer. Those who had gone missing, now twisted into grotesque mockeries of their former selves. Their mouths moved soundlessly, and their lifeless eyes stared at Lucas as though pleading for escape. A voice, no, many voices, spoke in unison inside his head. "Stay with us forever." Panic surged, and with one last desperate kick, Lucas broke free. He clawed his way to the surface, gasping for air. His arms burned as he dragged himself to the shoreline. The moment he collapsed on the mud, the lake fell silent. Its surface returned to an undisturbed, glassy calm. The shadowy figure was gone, but Lucas could still feel it, watching, waiting. He staggered to his feet, grabbed his gear, and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the ranger station. The hiker was nowhere to be found, and the building was eerily still. Lucas filed his report, but he left out the details. No one would believe him. He couldn't even believe it himself. For weeks afterward, he woke drenched in sweat, haunted by the voice that continued to echo in his dreams. "Why did you come?" Months later, another hiker went missing near Deadwater Lake. Search parties found no trace, only a single boot left by the muddy shore. And on quiet nights, locals whispered that if you listened closely, you could hear laughter drifting across the still water. Low, guttural, and far too human. The locals called it Deadwater Lake, though no map bore the name. Hidden deep within Silver Pines National Forest, it was a place avoided by even the most seasoned hikers. The water was unnaturally still, its surface perfectly smooth like a sheet of dark glass. Legends spoke of ghostly figures walking the shoreline and whispers calling from its depths. Those who ventured into the lake often never returned, and those who did came back, different. Ranger Lucas Kane didn't believe in ghost stories. Not until the night he got the call. A frantic hiker stumbled into the station just after sunset, pale and trembling. "My brother," he stammered. "He went into the water. Something pulled him under." Lucas grabbed his gear and set out immediately. The hiker, too shaken to follow, stayed behind. The trail leading to the lake was faint, overgrown. Lucas walked alone, his flashlight slicing through the thickening fog. The deeper he went, the more the air pressed against him, heavy and damp. As the lake came into view, it stopped him cold. The water was deathly still, its surface unbroken even as the wind moved the trees. The sight unnerved him more than he'd expected. He scanned the shoreline, calling out, "Hello? Anyone out here?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the buzz of insects. Just nothing. Then, the water rippled, just slightly, at the center of the lake. Lucas froze. His flashlight beam followed the movement until he saw it. A hand, pale and lifeless, rising slowly out of the water. His breath hitched, and before he could stop himself, he was running toward the shoreline. His boots sank into the muddy bank as he aimed the light back at the lake. A face appeared just below the surface, a man's face, eyes wide with terror. It had to be the missing brother. Lucas shouted, "Hold on!" and plunged into the water without a second thought. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer, a deep, bone-chilling cold that no wetsuit could have kept at bay. He fought through it, swimming toward the figure. The man was thrashing, his face now fully above the surface, gasping for air. Lucas stretched out his hand, nearly touching him. Then suddenly, the figure vanished. No splash, no struggle, just gone. Lucas stopped, treading water as his flashlight flickered. A whisper brushed past his ear. "Why did you come?" He spun around, flashlight sweeping the lake, but saw nothing, just the same eerie stillness. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. "Why did you come, Lucas?" His chest tightened. He hadn't given his name to anyone. The hiker at the station hadn't even known it. A chill ran up his spine as the water around him began to ripple again. This time, dozens of ripples formed, each moving toward him, each accompanied by faint whispers that grew louder and louder. Shapes began to rise from the water. Faces that weren't quite human, eyes like empty voids, mouths stretched into unnatural grins. They moved closer, surrounding him, their whispers turning into distorted, guttural laughter. Lucas turned back toward the shore, swimming with all his strength. The water pulled at him, thick and heavy like tar. He didn't dare look back. The laughter grew louder, and with it came a deep, resonant sound from beneath, like a massive heartbeat, slow and deliberate, vibrating through the water. Every stroke felt harder, every breath more labored. When he finally reached the bank, he stumbled out, collapsing onto the cold ground. The lake was silent again, its surface undisturbed. Lucas sat there, gasping for air, flashlight trembling in his hands. He turned back to look at the water, and there, just beneath the surface, were dozens of faint faces staring up at him. The whispers returned, softer now, but still present, carrying a single word, "Stay." Lucas grabbed his gear and ran. He didn't stop until he was back at the ranger station. His uniform was soaked, his teeth chattering, and his hands trembling as he filed his report. But when he sat down to write it, the words failed him. He couldn't bring himself to describe what he'd seen. How could he? He couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it. So he wrote only the basics: a hiker's report, an unsuccessful search, no sign of the missing brother. For weeks after, Lucas had nightmares. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers echoing in his ears. He tried to convince himself it was just stress, just exhaustion, just the overactive imagination of a ranger who'd spent too many nights alone in the woods. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that still, black water and those faces just beneath the surface. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the pull. The undeniable feeling that, no matter how far he stayed from the lake, a part of him wanted to go back, to see if the whispers would speak again. Months later, Lucas resigned from the service. He left Silver Pines behind, moved to a city far from any forest, and started a new life. But even now, when the nights are quiet and still, he sometimes hears the faint echo of a voice calling his name. And he knows that Deadwater Lake hasn't forgotten him.